The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick cream paper with the law firm's embossed letterhead catching the autumn sunlight streaming through my kitchen window. I held it in my trembling hands, knowing that inside lay the final details of my late husband Robert's estate settlement. 3 months had passed since his funeral, 3 months of paperwork and probate proceedings, 3 months of well-meaning church members telling me how blessed I was to have such a substantial inheritance to comfort me in my grief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I opened the envelope carefully, my reading glasses perched on my nose as I scanned the legal documents. The numbers were staggering. Robert had been more successful with his construction business than I'd ever realized. Between the life insurance, the business sale, and our investments, I was looking at nearly $2 million. $2 million that could secure my future, pay for the grandchildren's college educations, maybe even fund that small cottage by the lake Robert and I had always dreamed about. That's when Pastor Williams knocked on my door. I should have known something was different about his visit when he didn't accept my usual offer of sweet tea and homemade biscuits. Instead, he sat rigidly in Robert's old recliner, his hands folded in his lap, wearing that particular expression I'd seen him use when discussing the church's financial struggles during Sunday sermon. "Estelle," he began, his voice carrying that gentle authority he'd perfected over 20 years of ministry, "I've been praying about your situation, and the Lord has placed something heavy on my heart." He paused, letting the weight of divine guidance settle between us. "That inheritance Robert left you. It's a tremendous blessing, but I can't help wondering if perhaps God intends for you to bless others with it. My name is Estelle Warren, and for 43 years I thought I understood what faith looked like. I thought it meant showing up to every church service, volunteering for every committee, and saying yes to every request that came wrapped in the language of Christian duty. I thought it meant putting others first, always, even when the cost grew too heavy for my shoulders to bear. I'd been a member of Riverside Baptist Church since I was 19 years old, fresh out of high school and newly married to Robert Warren, a kind man with calloused hands and dreams of building something lasting. We'd started attending because Robert's mother insisted, but we stayed because Pastor Williams made us feel like family. The church was small then, maybe 60 members on a good Sunday, nestled in a brick building that had seen better decades, but still held the warmth of genuine community. Robert and I never had children of our own, despite years of hoping and praying and medical consultations that led nowhere but heartache. But the church became our family. I taught Sunday school for the little ones, organized potluck dinners, coordinated the Christmas pageant every year, and spent countless evenings in that fellowship hall folding bulletins and preparing communion elements. When other women my age were carpooling to soccer games and helping with homework, I was polishing the church pews and arranging flowers for the altar. Pastor Williams often called me the backbone of Riverside Baptist. "What would we do without our Estelle?" he'd say from the pulpit, and the congregation would nod and smile, and I'd feel that warm glow of purpose that comes from being needed, from being essential. Robert would squeeze my hand during those moments, proud of the woman he'd married, proud of how our childless home had become a hub of service and generosity. We gave generously too, far beyond the traditional tithe. When the church needed a new roof, Robert and I contributed $15,000 without hesitation. When the youth group wanted to go on a mission trip to Honduras, we sponsored 3 kids who couldn't afford to go. When Pastor Williams mentioned that his salary barely covered his family's needs, we quietly arranged for an anonymous monthly supplement that lasted for years. Our money went where our hearts were, and our hearts were firmly planted in the red brick building on Maple Street. Robert's construction business thrived, partly due to his reputation for honest work and partly because so many church connections led to referral. We lived modestly in our 3-bedroom ranch house, driving reliable but unremarkable cars, taking one vacation a year to visit Robert's sister in Colorado. We saved diligently, invested wisely, and always set aside a portion for the church and for helping others. It felt like the right way to live, the blessed way. When Robert started having chest pains last spring, Pastor Williams was the first person I called after the paramedic. He met us at the hospital, stayed with me through the long night in the waiting room, and held my hand when the doctor delivered the news that Robert's heart attack had been massive and fatal. At 58, my husband was gone, leaving me with a grief so profound I could barely remember how to breathe. The funeral was everything Robert would have wanted. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy about Robert's faithfulness, his generosity, his quiet strength. The church was packed with people whose lives Robert had touched through his work, his kindness, his steady presence. I sat in the front pew wearing my black dress and the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary, accepting condolences and trying to process the reality that I was now a widow at 57. In the weeks that followed, the church family surrounded me with casseroles and phone calls and invitations to dinner. Pastor Williams checked on me regularly, always asking how I was managing, always reminding me that the church was my family and would take care of me. I was grateful for the support, grateful for the sense that I wasn't alone in my grief, even as I struggled to figure out who I was without Robert beside me. The inheritance settlement took months to finalize. Robert had been meticulous about his affairs, but the business sale was complicated, and the lawyers moved with the careful slowness that comes with substantial sums of money. During that time, I continued my church activities, finding comfort in the familiar routines of service. I organized the fall festival, helped with the Thanksgiving dinner for families in need, and coordinated the Christmas toy drive with the same dedication I'd always shown. Pastor Williams seemed to take special interest in my well-being during this period. He'd stop by the house unannounced, always with some small concern about my emotional state or spiritual health. He'd mention how fortunate I was that Robert had provided so well for me, how rare it was for someone to face widowhood with such financial security. There was something in his tone during these visits that I couldn't quite identify, a kind of expectant quality that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I pushed the feeling aside. It was during one of these visits, about a month before the final settlement, that Pastor Williams first broached the subject of my future generosity. We were sitting in my living room, afternoon sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains Robert had hung just 2 years earlier, when he leaned forward with that earnest expression he wore during particularly important conversations. "Estelle," he said, "I've been thinking about how blessed you've been, even in this time of loss. Robert's provision for you is really quite remarkable." He paused, studying my face. "I imagine you'll want to honor his memory with the way you steward what he's left behind." I nodded, not sure where the conversation was headed. "Of course, Pastor. Robert was always generous with the church. I plan to continue that tradition." "I'm so glad to hear that," he replied, though something in his smile seemed calculated. "You know, we've been praying about some significant needs in our ministry. The building is showing its age, and we have such dreams for expanding our outreach programs. With the right kind of investment, we could really transform this community for Christ." The conversation ended there that day, but it planted a seed that would grow into something I never could have anticipated. Pastor Williams had always been persuasive, gifted at helping people see how their resources could serve God's kingdom, but this felt different, more personal, more urgent. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me overly sensitive to normal pastoral care. When the final settlement paperwork arrived that Tuesday morning, the full scope of Robert's success became clear. Nearly $2 million, far more than I'd expected, far more than Robert and I had ever discussed during our conversations about the future. My first emotion was amazement, followed quickly by a deep sadness that Robert would never see how well his careful planning had provided for me. My third emotion, which I'm ashamed to admit, was fear. Not fear of poverty or insecurity, but fear of the responsibility that came with such a substantial inheritance. That's when Pastor Williams arrived at my door, as if he had some kind of divine radar for significant financial news. He didn't waste time with small talk or his usual gentle inquiries about my emotional well-being. Instead, he launched directly into what felt like a prepared speech about stewardship and generosity, and the opportunities that God places before his faithful servant. "The Lord has been speaking to me about your situation, Estelle," he said, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence he used during sermons. "I believe he wants to use you in a mighty way, to be a blessing to his church and his people. Robert's success wasn't just for your benefit, it was preparation for something greater. He leaned forward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. His eyes bright with what I initially interpreted as spiritual fervor. We have such an opportunity right now. The church property next door is for sale, and if we could purchase it, we could expand our sanctuary, build proper classrooms for our growing children's ministry, maybe even add a fellowship hall large enough for real community events. But it would take a significant investment, probably around $300,000. The number hung in the air between us like a challenge. $300,000 was a substantial portion of my inheritance, but it wasn't unreasonable for a major church project. I found myself nodding along as he painted a picture of a revitalized Riverside Baptist, a beacon of hope and service in our small town of Millbrook. And then there's Pastor David, he continued, referring to his son who had recently graduated from seminary. He's been called to plant a church in the neighboring county, but he needs startup funding. $50,000 would give him everything he needs to begin this vital ministry. Can you imagine the souls that could be saved, the families that could be reached? My head was spinning with numbers and possibilities. Pastor Williams spoke with such conviction, such certainty that this was God's plan for my inheritance. He quoted scriptures about storing treasures in heaven rather than on earth, about the blessing that comes to those who give cheerfully and sacrificially. Everything he said sounded reasonable, even admirable. I'm not asking for an answer today, he said as he prepared to leave, though his tone suggested he expected one soon. I just want you to pray about it. Ask God how he wants to use Robert's legacy. I have a feeling he's going to do something amazing through your faithfulness. After he left, I sat in Robert's chair holding the settlement papers, trying to process what had just happened. On one hand, everything Pastor Williams suggested aligned with the values Robert and I had always held. We believed in supporting the church, in using our resources for God's kingdom, in being generous with what we'd been given. On the other hand, something felt rushed about his approach, as if he'd been planning this conversation for weeks. I spent that evening walking through the house Robert and I had shared, remembering his dreams and priorities. He'd often talked about wanting to travel more in retirement, about the little cottage by Lake Catherine where we could spend our golden years fishing and reading and enjoying the peace we'd earned through decades of hard work. He'd worried about my security if something happened to him, insisting on life insurance policies that seemed excessive at the time, but now looked like the wisdom of a man who understood his mortality. Would Robert want me to give away most of his life's work to the church? Would he see Pastor Williams's vision as a worthy continuation of our generous legacy? Or would he be concerned about my future security? These questions swirled through my mind as I tried to pray for guidance, but the answers felt murky and uncertain. The next morning, Pastor Williams called before I'd even finished my coffee. Estelle, I hope you don't mind me following up so soon, but I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. The Lord really seemed to be moving in that moment, didn't I? Murmured agreement, still unsure of my own feelings about his proposals. I've been in touch with the real estate agent about the property next door, he continued, and there's another interested party. If we're going to make this happen, we need to move quickly. I hate to pressure you, but sometimes God's timing requires prompt action. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Pastor Williams had a gift for making spiritual urgency feel like divine mandate, for suggesting that delays in generosity might indicate a lack of faith or commitment. I heard myself saying I would consider his request seriously, that I understood the importance of acting when God was clearly opening doors. Over the next few days, Pastor Williams increased the frequency of his visits and phone calls. Each conversation included new details about the church expansion project, additional needs that had come to light, other opportunities for ministry investment that seemed perfectly aligned with my inheritance. The $50,000 for his son's church plant had grown to $75,000 when they factored in the cost of sound equipment and office furniture. The property purchase required not just the initial $300,000, but an additional $50,000 for immediate renovations that couldn't wait. I found myself nodding along with each new request, caught up in his enthusiasm and vision. Pastor Williams had always been persuasive, but now his influence felt overwhelming, as if questioning his guidance would be tantamount to questioning God himself. When I mentioned that I wanted to take some time to pray and consider everything carefully, he smiled and patted my hand in a way that felt patronizing. Of course, dear Estelle, prayer is always wise. But remember, sometimes God tests our faith by asking us to act boldly, without all the certainty our human minds desire. Abraham didn't know where he was going when God called him to leave his homeland, but his obedience brought blessing. The biblical references were perfectly chosen, designed to make hesitation seem like lack of faith. I'd heard Pastor Williams use similar techniques from the pulpit, weaving scripture and emotion together in ways that made resistance feel like spiritual rebellion. But this was personal, focused entirely on my inheritance and my willingness to sacrifice for the kingdom. A week after our initial conversation, Pastor Williams arrived at my house with his wife Margaret and their son David, the aspiring church planter. The visit felt orchestrated, as if they'd rehearsed their roles in advance. Margaret talked about how proud she was of David's calling, how rare it was for young people to dedicate their lives to ministry in an age of materialism and selfishness. David spoke passionately about the spiritual needs in Harrison County, about the families who had no church home, about the opportunity to build something lasting for God's glory. "Miss Warren," David said, his young face earnest and sincere, "I know this is a significant request, but I believe God has specifically prepared you to be part of this ministry. Your generosity could literally change eternity for countless people." The weight of eternal responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. How could I say no to souls being saved? How could I prioritize my own financial security over the spiritual needs of people I'd never met? Pastor Williams watched my face carefully as his son spoke, nodding at particularly compelling moments, adding his own affirmations about God's clear leading in this situation. By the time they left that evening, I had verbally committed to $400,000, $300,000 for the property purchase, $75,000 for David's church plant, and $25,000 for what Pastor Williams called seed money for future ministry opportunities that would surely arise once word spread about Riverside Baptist's expansion. At $400,000, nearly a quarter of my inheritance, committed in the span of 2 hours to projects I barely understood, led by people whose motives I was only beginning to question. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, I wondered if Robert would be proud of my generosity or alarmed by my naivety. The documentation process moved with surprising speed. Pastor Williams had apparently consulted with church lawyers even before our initial conversation, because the paperwork was ready within days of my commitment. Legal documents outlining the property purchase, ministry funding agreements, and tax-efficient giving strategies that would minimize my liability while maximizing the church's benefit. "You're being so wise about this, Estelle," Pastor Williams said as I signed document after document in his church office. "Not many people understand how to structure giving in ways that honor both God and good stewardship. You're setting an example that other members will want to follow." The comment about other members following my example should have raised red flags, but I was too focused on the immediate decisions to think about long-term implications. I was setting a precedent, establishing myself as someone willing to give sacrificially when the church had significant need. I was becoming Pastor Williams's primary exhibit of faithful generosity, his proof that God blessed those who gave boldly to his work. The check presentations were made during Sunday morning worship services, with Pastor Williams calling me to the front of the sanctuary to receive the congregation's applause and gratitude. Standing there with the oversized ceremonial checks, smiling as camera phones captured the moment for the church's social media accounts, I felt simultaneously honored and exposed. This was public now, documented and celebrated, making any future hesitation about giving seem like backsliding from a higher spiritual standard. "Let's give Sister Estelle another round of applause," Pastor Williams announced, his voice booming through the sanctuary's sound system. "This is what faithfulness looks like, church. This is how we respond when God calls us to be generous with his blessings." The applause felt warm and affirming, but underneath it I sensed something else, expectation. Other members would now measure their own giving against my example. Pastor Williams had effectively raised the bar for congregational generosity, using my inheritance as the new standard for spiritual commitment. After the service, people clustered around me with congratulations and thanks, telling me how blessed they felt to be part of a church with such generous members. Their gratitude was genuine, their excitement about the upcoming expansion projects was real, but I found myself feeling strangely empty instead of fulfilled. This wasn't the quiet, private generosity that Robert and I had always practiced. This was performance, spectacle, a public demonstration of financial sacrifice that felt more like showmanship than worship. That afternoon, sitting alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the church bulletins that featured photos from the morning ceremony, I realized that Pastor Williams had fundamentally changed my relationship with both my inheritance and my church family. I was no longer just Estelle Warren, faithful member and volunteer. I was now Estelle Warren, major donor and example of sacrificial giving. The distinction felt significant and slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. The discomfort would only grow in the weeks that followed, as Pastor Williams's requests became more frequent and more substantial. Having established my willingness to give large amounts quickly, he seemed to view my inheritance as a renewable resource for whatever ministry needs arose. Each new opportunity was presented with the same mixture of spiritual urgency and emotional manipulation that had characterized our initial conversations. What I didn't realize yet was that I had crossed a line from generous church member to something else entirely. I had become Pastor Williams's personal funding source, his solution to every financial challenge the church might face, and once that transformation was complete, it would be almost impossible to go back to the simpler relationship I'd once enjoyed with my church family. The requests that followed would test not just my generosity but my discernment, my courage, and ultimately my understanding of what faithful stewardship really meant. Pastor Williams had said I was too generous, but I was about to learn that the problem wasn't the amount I was giving. The problem was what I was accepting in return, and how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice in the name of spiritual obedience. The transformation in Pastor Williams was gradual, so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Where once his visits had been warm pastoral check-ins, filled with genuine concern for my grief and adjustment to widowhood, they now carried an undercurrent of expectation. He would arrive at my door with that practiced smile, but his eyes would scan my living room as if calculating the value of Robert's antique desk or the crystal vase my mother had left me. It started with casual observations. During one afternoon visit, he admired the oil painting Robert had commissioned of our wedding day, commenting on how talented local artists deserved support from people who appreciated their work. Within the same conversation, he mentioned that the church's fellowship hall walls looked bare. How wonderful it would be to showcase local Christian artists if only there were funds to commission meaningful pieces. You know, Estelle, he said, running his finger along the gilded frame, there's something beautiful about art that tells a story of faith. This painting represents your love story with Robert, but imagine what we could display that would tell God's love story to everyone who enters our church. The suggestion hung in the air between us like incense, sweet and persuasive. Before I could process what was happening, I found myself agreeing to sponsor a series of religious paintings for the fellowship hall. $3,000 seemed reasonable for artwork that would inspire worship and honor Robert's memory simultaneously. But Pastor Williams wasn't finished. As I wrote the check, he mentioned almost casually that his daughter Rebecca was struggling with her college tuition payments. She was studying Christian education at a private university, preparing for a life of ministry, but the costs were overwhelming for a pastor's family. I hate to see young people with such calling burdened by debt, he said, his voice heavy with paternal concern. Rebecca has such a heart for children's ministry, but she's considering dropping out and working instead of finishing her degree. It breaks Margaret's heart. The emotional manipulation was masterful. Rebecca had sat for several church families and always seemed sweet, though I barely knew her personally, but the image of a young woman sacrificing her ministry calling because of financial pressure struck deep. Within minutes, I was writing another check, this one for $8,000 to cover Rebecca's remaining tuition. Pastor Williams accepted the check with tears in his eyes, clasping my hands and praying over me right there in my living room. Father, we thank you for Sister Estelle's generous heart. Bless her abundantly for her faithfulness to your children. Let this gift multiply in kingdom impact beyond what we can imagine. The prayer felt genuine, his gratitude seemed authentic. But something nagged at me as he left that day. The timing felt too convenient, the requests too perfectly timed to my emotional vulnerabilities. When I grieved Robert's absence, Pastor Williams appeared with opportunities to honor his memory through giving. When I felt lonely and disconnected, he presented chances to impact young lives and feel needed again. Over the following weeks, the pattern intensified. Pastor Williams began dropping by without calling first, often arriving during mealtimes with apologies for the intrusion, but urgent news that couldn't wait. The expansion project was moving faster than expected, and additional funds were needed for architectural plans. David's church plant was approved for a prime location, but the lease required a larger security deposit than anticipated. The fellowship hall paintings were so well received that other churches were asking Riverside Baptist to host an art ministry conference, but hosting required upgraded lighting and display systems. Each new request came wrapped in spiritual language and emotional urgency. Pastor Williams had perfected the art of making every financial need sound like a divine opportunity, every hesitation like a crisis of faith. He would arrive with detailed plans and passionate explanations, leaving little time for careful consideration or outside counsel. The Lord works quickly when his people are ready to respond, he would say whenever I mentioned wanting to think about a particular request. I'd hate for us to miss what he's doing because we're too cautious. The subtle pressure was relentless. Pastor Williams began sharing stories during his sermons about faithful believers throughout history, who gave sacrificially when God called them to extraordinary generosity. He would tell tales of biblical figures who risked everything for kingdom purposes, modern missionaries who sold their possessions to fund gospel work, wealthy businessmen who anonymously supported ministries that changed nations. God is looking for people who will say yes before they see the whole plan, he preached one Sunday, his eyes finding mine in the congregation. He's searching for hearts that trust him enough to step out in faith, even when the world calls them foolish. The message felt directed specifically at me, and judging by the glances from other congregation members, I wasn't alone in that perception. Pastor Williams had begun using my giving as sermon illustrations, careful never to mention my name but describing situations that were clearly references to my recent donation. The congregation knew who he was talking about, and I could feel their expectations settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. Margaret Williams, the pastor's wife, also began paying me special attention. She would seek me out after services, during church events, and at community gatherings, always with some new insight about how my generosity was transforming the church family. Her compliments felt calculated, designed to reinforce my identity as the congregation's most faithful giver. Estelle, dear, I was just telling my sister about how blessed we are to have someone like you in our church family, she said during one particularly awkward conversation at the grocery store. Not everyone understands what real Christian stewardship looks like, but you're such an example to the rest of us. These public affirmations made it increasingly difficult to question or decline Pastor Williams's requests. How could I disappoint someone who saw me as a spiritual role model? How could I risk seeming selfish or faithless after being held up as an example of proper Christian generosity? The financial requests were also becoming more creative and complex. Pastor Williams arrived one Tuesday morning with a thick folder containing what he called a comprehensive ministry development plan. Inside were proposals for a Christian daycare center, a food pantry expansion, a youth sports league, and a senior citizen outreach program. Each initiative required substantial startup funding, and together they represented an investment of nearly $300,000. I know this seems like a lot, he said, spreading the documents across my kitchen table like a salesman presenting his finest merchandise. But think about the multi-generational impact we could have. Children in daycare learning biblical values from their earliest years, families receiving food assistance along with spiritual guidance, teenagers choosing church sports over worldly activity, seniors finding purpose and community in their golden years. The vision was compelling, painted in broad strokes that emphasized kingdom impact over financial detail. Pastor Williams had learned to present each request as part of a larger narrative about transforming our community for Christ, making individual donations seem like investments in eternal significance rather than simple monetary transactions. But when I asked for more specific information about timelines, oversight, and accountability measures, Pastor Williams seemed surprised by my question. "Well, naturally, the church board will provide oversight," he said, though I knew the board consisted primarily of his close friends and longtime supporters, "and I'll personally ensure that every dollar is used exactly as intended." His personal guarantee felt insufficient, especially given the substantial amounts involved, but questioning his integrity seemed tantamount to questioning his spiritual authority. Pastor Williams had positioned himself as God's representative in these financial matters, making skepticism feel like rebellion against divine will. The pressure reached a new level when Pastor Williams began involving other church members in his appeals for my continued generosity. He would arrange for people to share testimonies during services about how my previous donations had blessed their lives. Rebecca Williams gave a tearful speech about finishing college debt-free because of my support. The artists whose work now graced the fellowship hall spoke eloquently about how their ministry had been validated by my investment in Christian art. "We want Sister Estelle to know how much her faithfulness means to our church family," Pastor Williams announced during one particularly elaborate recognition ceremony. "Her example of sacrificial giving is inspiring others to step up in their own generosity." The ceremony felt more like a trap than an honor. Standing at the front of the sanctuary while the congregation applauded, I felt exposed and manipulated rather than celebrated. Pastor Williams was using public recognition to increase the social pressure for continued giving, making future refusals seem like betrayals of the entire church community. After that service, several members approached me with their own requests for financial assistance. They had heard about my generosity through Pastor Williams's various announcements and assumed I was available to help with personal needs as well. A young couple asked for help with their mortgage payments. An elderly widow needed funds for medical expenses. A single mother wanted assistance with her son's private school tuition. Each request came with heartfelt explanations and genuine needs, but together they represented a fundamental shift in how church members viewed me. I was no longer Estelle Warren, fellow believer and friend. I had become Estelle Warren, source of financial solutions, the person you approached when money troubles seemed insurmountable. Pastor Williams encouraged these individual requests, suggesting they were evidence of how my example was creating a culture of mutual support within the church family. "This is what biblical community looks like," he told me during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "People caring for each other, sharing resources, meeting needs together." But the burden of constant requests was becoming overwhelming. My phone rang regularly with people explaining their financial difficulties and asking for assistance. My mailbox filled with letters from church members detailing their struggles and hoping for help. Even casual conversations after services became opportunities for people to mention their money troubles and gauge my willingness to contribute to solutions. The most troubling development was Pastor Williams's growing expectation that I would fund church operations beyond special projects. When the monthly offering fell short of budget requirements, he would call with urgent appeals for supplemental donation. When unexpected expenses arose, like repairing the church van or replacing broken equipment, he presented them as emergencies requiring immediate attention from generous supporters like myself. "I hate to keep coming to you," he would say, though his actions suggested otherwise. "But you understand ministry in ways that other members don't. You see the bigger picture of what God is trying to accomplish through our church." These operational funding requests felt different from the special projects that had characterized our early conversation. Instead of investing in growth and expansion, I was being asked to cover basic expenses that should have been supported by regular congregational giving. Pastor Williams was treating my inheritance like the church's emergency fund, available whenever other revenue sources proved inadequate. The financial pressure was matched by increasing social isolation from church members who couldn't relate to my sudden prominence as a major donor. Friendships that had developed over years of shared service and worship became awkward and strained. People who had once treated me as an equal now seemed to view me as either a benefactor to cultivate, or a standard they couldn't match. During one particularly painful conversation, my longtime friend Helen confided that she felt uncomfortable around me, since my giving had become so public. "It's not that I'm jealous," she said carefully. "It's just that everything feels different now. When we talk about church needs or pray about financial requests, I feel like my $20 donations don't really matter anymore." Helen's honesty stung because it revealed how Pastor Williams's strategy was affecting the entire congregation. By elevating my giving to such prominence, he had inadvertently created a hierarchy of generosity that made other members feel inadequate or insignificant. The sense of community that had always characterized Riverside Baptist was being eroded by comparisons and expectations that never should have existed. Even more concerning was the way Pastor Williams had begun making decisions based on assumptions about my continued financial support. He would announce new initiatives during services before discussing them with the church board, confident that I would provide funding if the congregation could. He committed to expenses and projects without proper authorization, then presented them to me as accomplished facts, requiring retroactive financial backing. "I know I should have discussed this with you first," he said after announcing plans for a new church website and social media ministry during Sunday service, "but the opportunity came up suddenly, and I felt the Lord's leading so strongly. The design team needs a $5,000 deposit by Friday to get started." These presumptuous commitments put me in impossible positions. Refusing to fund projects he had already announced publicly made me look unsupportive of ministry initiatives, but continuing to enable his unauthorized decisions was setting dangerous precedents for financial accountability and decision-making processes. The breaking point came during a church board meeting that Pastor Williams invited me to attend as a special advisor on ministry development. I should have recognized the setup immediately, but I was still operating under the assumption that his motives were purely ministry-focused rather than personally beneficial. The meeting took place on a humid Thursday evening in the church conference room, with all 5 board members present along with Pastor Williams and myself. The official agenda focused on routine business like budget approvals and facility maintenance, but Pastor Williams quickly steered the conversation toward more ambitious topics. "Before we discuss regular business," he announced, "I want to share some exciting opportunities that have come to my attention. God has been opening doors for ministry expansion that we never could have imagined." He proceeded to outline plans for purchasing the vacant lot behind the church property, establishing a Christian bookstore and coffee shop in the downtown area, and launching a radio ministry that would broadcast our services throughout the region. Each project was presented with impressive research and compelling justifications, but the combined cost exceeded $400,000. "Now I know these numbers seem substantial," Pastor Williams continued, his eyes finding mine across the conference table, "but we have been blessed with generous supporters who understand the importance of seizing divine opportunities when they arise." Board member Tom Henderson, a local banker who had always been cautious about church finances, raised his hand tentatively. "Pastor, these are significant investments. Do we have confirmed funding sources for projects of this magnitude?" Pastor Williams smiled confidently and gestured toward me. "Sister Estelle has been such a blessing to our ministry development. I believe the Lord will continue to provide through faithful stewards like her." The assumption was breathtaking. Pastor Williams was presenting my continued giving as guaranteed income for the church, committing to expenses based on his expectation that I would fund whatever projects he deemed worthwhile. He had essentially made me an unofficial member of the church's financial planning team without my knowledge or consent. "I appreciate everyone's confidence," I said carefully, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of eyes focused on me. "But I think there might be some misunderstanding about my role in funding these initiatives." Pastor Williams looked genuinely surprised, as if the possibility of my declining to fund his plans had never occurred to him. "Oh, of course, Sister Estelle, we would never presume upon your generosity. I was simply sharing vision that I believe God has given us, trusting that He will provide the resources through whatever means He chooses." But the damage was done. The board members now understood that Pastor Williams had been counting on my inheritance to fund his ministry expansion plan. Their expressions ranged from embarrassment to concern as they realized how much of the church's future development depended on one person's continued financial contribution. Board member Sarah Mitchell, a retired teacher who had known me since I joined the church, spoke up with obvious discomfort. "Pastor Williams, I think we need to be very careful about planning expenditures based on individual donations, regardless of how generous those individuals have." "Absolutely," Pastor Williams agreed quickly, but his tone suggested he was merely acknowledging their concerns, rather than accepting their guidance. "We'll certainly want to pray about timing and funding sources for all of these opportunities." The meeting concluded with awkward pleasantries and promises to seek the Lord's direction about the proposed projects, but I left feeling manipulated and exposed. Pastor Williams had used my presence at the board meeting to legitimize his assumption that I would fund whatever ministry initiatives he deemed important. He had positioned me as the church's primary financial resource, without consulting me about my willingness or ability to fulfill that role. Driving home that night, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what had been building for months. Pastor Williams wasn't treating me like a church member anymore. He was treating me like a personal ATM, available to fund whatever projects or needs he prioritized. My inheritance had transformed me from a person into a resource, valuable only for my ability to write checks for ministry expenses. The realization was painful but clarifying. I had been so focused on honoring Robert's memory through generosity that I had allowed Pastor Williams to redefine my entire relationship with the church around my financial capacity. I had become his primary solution to every funding challenge, his automatic answer to every budget shortfall, his go-to resource for turning ministry dreams into reality. But what disturbed me most was recognizing how skillfully he had manipulated both my grief and my faith to achieve his goal. He had used my love for Robert to justify excessive donations in his memory. He had leveraged my commitment to the church to extract funds for questionable projects. He had weaponized biblical principles about generosity to pressure me into giving beyond wisdom or prudence. The next morning I sat in Robert's chair with my coffee and my checkbook, calculating how much of my inheritance I had already committed to Pastor Williams's various initiatives. The total was staggering. In less than 6 months I had donated or pledged nearly $800,000 to church projects, individual requests, and ministry development plans. $800,000, nearly half of Robert's life insurance and business proceeds, given away before I had even begun to process my grief or plan for my own future. The magnitude of what I had done hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and nauseated. But even more troubling was the realization that Pastor Williams showed no signs of slowing down his requests. If anything, my previous generosity had only increased his expectations for future giving. He was treating my inheritance like an inexhaustible resource, available to fund whatever needs or opportunities arose in his ministry. I needed time to think, space to process what had happened, and wisdom to determine how to move forward. But Pastor Williams had created a situation where any hesitation about giving seemed like spiritual backsliding, any questions about his requests felt like challenges to his authority, and any attempt to establish boundaries looked like selfishness or lack of faith. That afternoon, when Pastor Williams called with news about another urgent ministry opportunity requiring immediate funding, I did something I hadn't done in months. I said I needed time to pray about it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long before he responded. "Of course, Sister Estelle, prayer is always wise. I just hope we don't miss what God is trying to do because we're overthinking his clear direction." Even in agreeing to my request for time, Pastor Williams managed to suggest that delays in giving might indicate spiritual immaturity or lack of faith. But for the first time since Robert's death, I held firm to my boundary despite his subtle pressure. "I'll call you back when I've had time to consider everything properly," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. After hanging up, I realized I had taken the first small step toward reclaiming control of my inheritance and my relationship with the church. It felt terrifying and liberating simultaneously, like stepping off a cliff while spreading wings I wasn't sure would support me. But I was finally beginning to understand that Pastor Williams's definition of Christian generosity had nothing to do with biblical stewardship or spiritual growth. It had everything to do with maintaining his access to my inheritance for whatever purposes he deemed worthy of funding. The question now was whether I had the courage to continue setting boundaries, knowing that doing so would likely result in conflict with someone who had positioned himself as my spiritual authority and pastoral guide. The answer would determine not just my financial future, but my spiritual integrity and personal dignity as well. The morning everything shattered started like any other Wednesday. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading my devotional when the doorbell rang with unusual persistence, 3 sharp bursts followed by a pause, then 3 more. Through the peephole I could see Pastor Williams shifting his weight from foot to foot, his face flushed and agitated in a way I'd never witnessed before. When I opened the door, he barely managed a greeting before pushing past me into the living room. His normally pristine appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his tie askew. Most alarming was the manila envelope clutched in his white-knuckled grip, thick with documents that he began spreading across my coffee table without invitation. "Estelle, we have a situation," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I need you to understand what's happening here before anyone else gets involved." The documents were bank statements, loan applications, and what appeared to be legal notices. As I scanned the papers, trying to make sense of the financial jargon and official letterheads, Pastor Williams paced behind my couch like a caged animal. "The church is in serious financial trouble," he said, his pastoral composure completely abandoned. "Worse than I've let anyone know. The expansion projects David's church plant, all the ministry initiatives we've been developing, they've created cash flow problems that I didn't anticipate." I looked up from the papers, my stomach beginning to churn as I processed what he was telling me. "What kind of cash flow problem?" Pastor Williams stopped pacing and fixed me with a desperate stare. "We're 3 months behind on our mortgage payments. The bank is threatening foreclosure if we don't catch up immediately. The contractors working on the fellowship hall expansion are demanding payment before they'll continue, and the IRS has questions about some of our financial reporting that require immediate attention." The room seemed to spin as I realized the implications of what he was revealing. All those projects I had funded, all those ministry initiatives that had seemed so important and urgent, had apparently been mismanaged to the point of threatening the church's very existence. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Pastor Williams sat heavily in Robert's chair, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. "Immediate needs total about $250,000, but that's just to stabilize things temporarily. To really solve the underlying problems and complete the projects we've started, we'd need closer to $500,000. $500,000, the number hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Even with my substantial inheritance, that represented a significant portion of my remaining resources. More importantly, it represented a level of financial crisis that suggested fundamental problems with the church's leadership and decision-making processes." "How did this happen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "All the money I've donated, all the projects we've funded, where did it all go?" Pastor Williams launched into a complex explanation involving cost overruns, unexpected expenses, and economic factors beyond his control. But as he talked, inconsistencies in his story became apparent. The fellowship hall expansion had required additional structural work that wasn't in the original estimates. David's church plant had encountered zoning issues that demanded legal fees and permit modification. The Ministry Development Fund had been temporarily borrowed against to cover operational expenses that would be repaid once other funding sources materialized. "Borrowed against?" I interrupted. "You used ministry funds for operational expenses without telling anyone?" His face reddened, and for the first time in our relationship, Pastor Williams looked genuinely guilty. "It was a temporary measure. Churches often have to make these kinds of adjustments when income fluctuates. I fully intended to restore those funds once our stewardship campaign brought in additional revenue. But there had been no stewardship campaign. Pastor Williams had been counting on my continued donations to solve whatever financial problems arose, treating my inheritance like the church's personal line of credit. When I had started asking questions and requesting time to pray about his requests, his entire financial strategy had begun to collapse. "The board doesn't know about any of this, do they?" I asked, though his expression had already confirmed my suspicion. "I didn't want to alarm them unnecessarily," he said defensively. "Board members don't always understand the complexities of managing church finances. They tend to panic about temporary setbacks that experienced pastors know how to handle." His condescending tone finally broke through my shock and activated my anger. Pastor Williams had not only mismanaged hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations, he had done so without proper oversight or accountability. He had treated the church's finances like his personal kingdom, making decisions unilaterally and expecting others to fund whatever consequences resulted. "You've been lying to everyone," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "The board, the congregation, me, you've been pretending everything was fine while you were bankrupting the church." Pastor Williams stood abruptly, his own anger flashing to the surface. "I have been trying to build God's kingdom while small-minded people worry about spreadsheets and budget. Vision requires risk. Estelle, great ministries aren't built by people who are afraid to step out in faith." The biblical language that had once seemed so persuasive now sounded hollow and manipulative. Pastor Williams was using spiritual rhetoric to justify financial irresponsibility, presenting his poor decisions as evidence of divine calling rather than human error. "This isn't about vision or faith," I replied, standing to face him directly. "This is about honesty and stewardship. You've been spending money you didn't have on projects that weren't properly planned, and now you expect me to bail you out." His expression shifted from anger to the practiced vulnerability he'd used so effectively during our earlier conversations. "Estelle, I know I know I should have been more transparent about the challenges we were facing, but everything I've done has been for the church, for the ministry, for the kingdom of God." He moved closer, his voice taking on the gentle paternal tone that had once made me feel protected and guided. "You've been such a blessing to this ministry. Your generosity has already accomplished so much good. I hate to ask for more, but this is our moment of testing. This is where we find out if our faith is strong enough to overcome temporary obstacles." The emotional manipulation was so transparent now that I wondered how I had ever fallen for it. Pastor Williams was using the same techniques that had worked before, appealing to my desire to honor Robert's memory and serve God's purposes. But this time, I could see the strings he was pulling, the calculated way he was trying to extract more money from my inheritance. "No," I said simply, the word feeling foreign but powerful in my mouth. "I will not give you any more money to cover up your financial mismanagement." Pastor Williams stared at me, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. In his mind, my refusal to fund his crisis management was inconceivable, a betrayal of everything he thought our relationship represented. "You don't understand the consequences of that decision," he said, his tone becoming threatening. "If this church fails financially, it will be because you chose selfishness over stewardship. You'll bear responsibility for destroying a ministry that has served this community for decades." The guilt manipulation was aggressive now, designed to make me feel responsible for problems I hadn't created. Pastor Williams was trying to transfer accountability for his poor decisions onto my shoulders, making my inheritance the solution to his irresponsible leadership. But I had finally reached my limit. Months of exploitation, manipulation, and financial pressure had built to this moment of clarity. I could see Pastor Williams for what he really was: not a spiritual leader deserving of trust and support, but a manipulative man who had used my grief and faith to access my money. "The consequences of your financial decisions are not my responsibility," I said, walking toward the front door and opening it. Pointedly, "I suggest you explain the situation to the church board and congregation immediately. They deserve to know what you've done with their donations and mine." Pastor Williams gathered his papers with shaking hands, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and desperation. At the doorway, he turned back one final time. "You're making a terrible mistake. God will not bless selfishness, and this community will not forget who abandoned them in their time of need." After he left, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the silence he had shattered, trying to process what had just occurred. For months I had been questioning my own instincts, wondering if my growing discomfort with Pastor Williams's requests indicated spiritual immaturity or lack of faith. Now I understood that my intuition had been correct all along. Pastor Williams had never seen me as a person with my own needs, goals, and limitations. From the moment he learned about my inheritance, I had become a resource to be exploited, a solution to whatever financial challenges arose in his ministry. My grief, my faith, My desire to honor Robert's memory, all of these had been tools he used to manipulate me into funding his irresponsible decisions. The phone started ringing within an hour of his departure. Margaret Williams called first, her voice strained and tearful as she tried to convince me that her husband was under tremendous pressure and hadn't meant to upset me. Rebecca called next, sobbing about how my support had meant everything to her education, and couldn't I find it in my heart to help the church through this difficult time. I let the calls go to voicemail, needing space to think without additional emotional manipulation. But the messages revealed how completely Pastor Williams had involved his family in his fundraising strategy. They had all been coached to appeal to my emotions when direct requests failed, creating a network of guilt and obligation designed to extract maximum financial compliance. By evening, word had apparently spread through at least part of the congregation. Church members began calling with confused and concerned questions about rumors they'd heard regarding financial problems. Most assumed I would have information since my giving had been so prominent, but I referred them all to Pastor Williams and the church board. The next morning brought a registered letter from the church's attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss my ongoing financial commitments to ministry development initiative. The legal language was polite but firm, suggesting that Pastor Williams was exploring ways to enforce pledges or donations that hadn't yet been fully paid. I called my own attorney immediately, a kind woman named Patricia Hendricks, who had handled Robert's estate planning. As I explained the situation, I could hear her sharp intake of breath when I described the amounts I had already donated and the additional funds Pastor Williams was demanding. "Estelle, I need to ask you some difficult questions," Patricia said gently. "Did you sign any binding agreements about future donations? Did anyone pressure you to make these gifts while you were grieving? Did Pastor Williams or anyone else suggest that you had obligations beyond what you explicitly agreed to provide?" The questions forced me to examine my experience with uncomfortable honesty. Yes, I had been pressured while grieving. Yes, Pastor Williams had used emotional manipulation to secure donations. Yes, he had created expectations about future giving without my explicit consent. "Based on what you're telling me," Patricia continued, "it sounds like you may have been the victim of financial exploitation. Religious leaders are not immune from fraud charges when they use their position to deceive or manipulate vulnerable people." The word fraud hit me like a physical blow. I had trusted Pastor Williams completely, never imagining that his spiritual authority could be corrupted by greed or personal ambition. The possibility that his behavior might constitute criminal activity added a new dimension to my growing understanding of what had been done to me. Patricia scheduled a meeting for the following week to review all documentation related to my donations and assess whether any legal action might be appropriate. In the meantime, she advised me to avoid any contact with Pastor Williams or church representatives who might try to pressure me for additional funds. But Pastor Williams wasn't finished with his campaign to extract more money from my inheritance. On Friday evening, he appeared at my door, accompanied by 3 church board members, all of whom looked uncomfortable but determined. Tom Henderson, the banker who had expressed concerns about financial planning, seemed particularly reluctant to be part of whatever intervention they had planned. "Estelle, we need to talk," Pastor Williams announced, his tone carrying the authority he typically reserved for particularly serious pastoral counseling sessions. "There are some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up before they cause permanent damage to our church family." I invited them into my living room, curious about what new manipulation strategy they had devised. The board members arranged themselves around the room while Pastor Williams took his familiar position in Robert's chair, apparently comfortable claiming that space despite my obvious discomfort. "We've been praying about the financial challenges facing our church," board member Sarah Mitchell began, her teacher's voice carefully modulated for maximum persuasive impact. "We believe God has provided resources through your inheritance to help us through this temporary difficulty." The presumption was breathtaking. Not only were they assuming I should solve their financial crisis, they were presenting it as divine will rather than acknowledging the mismanagement that had created the problem. Tom Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Estelle, I want you to know that we understand this is a significant request, but given your previous generosity and your commitment to this church, we hope you'll consider helping us stabilize our finances. How much of the situation do you actually understand?" I asked, looking at each board member in turn. Do you know where all the money went? Do you know about the unauthorized borrowing from ministry funds? Do you know that Pastor Williams has been making financial commitments without board approval? The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed my suspicion that they had been given sanitized versions of the financial crisis. Pastor Williams had likely presented the problems as temporary cash flow issues, rather than admitting to the pattern of mismanagement that had created them. There have been some administrative challenges, Pastor Williams said carefully, but nothing that can't be resolved with proper support from our church family. I stood up and walked to my desk, retrieving copies of the bank statements and legal documents Pastor Williams had shown me earlier in the week. Let me show you what administrative challenges actually mean. As the board members reviewed the paperwork, their expressions shifted from concern to alarm to outright shock. The magnitude of the financial problems became clear, as did the pattern of decisions that had created them. Tom Henderson's banking background allowed him to spot irregularities that the others missed, and his questions revealed additional concerning practices. Pastor Williams, Tom said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, some of these expenditures required board approval that was never requested, and this transfer from the Ministry Development Fund to operational expenses that needed specific authorization. Pastor Williams began offering explanations and justifications, but the board members were no longer listening with the deference they had shown when they arrived. They were seeing their pastor's financial management with new eyes, and what they saw was deeply troubling. Sarah Mitchell set down the papers she had been reviewing and looked directly at me. Estelle, given what we're seeing here, I don't think anyone should expect you to resolve financial problems that resulted from decisions you weren't involved in making. Her statement represented a crack in the united front Pastor Williams had apparently expected from his board member. As they continued reviewing documentation and asking pointed questions, it became clear that several of them were discovering the extent of financial irregularities for the first time. Pastor Williams tried to regain control of the conversation by appealing to their shared ministry goals and spiritual commitments, but his credibility had been severely damaged by the revelations in the paperwork. When board member Janet Murphy asked why he hadn't informed them about the mortgage delinquency, his evasive answer only raised additional questions about his transparency and accountability. The meeting ended with the board members agreeing to conduct a comprehensive financial audit before making any decisions about fundraising or crisis management. They left my house looking shaken and confused, their trust in their pastor's leadership clearly undermined by what they had learned. Pastor Williams remained behind after the board members departed, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You've just destroyed 20 years of ministry," he said, his voice tight with rage. "Everything I've built for God's kingdom is going to collapse because you chose money over faith." His accusation revealed the fundamental delusion that had driven his behavior throughout our relationship. Pastor Williams genuinely believed that my inheritance existed primarily to fund his ministry vision, that my refusal to subsidize his poor decisions represented spiritual failure rather than reasonable financial boundaries. "I didn't destroy anything," I replied calmly. "You created this crisis through your own choices. I'm just refusing to enable your irresponsibility any longer." He stormed out without another word, leaving me alone with the recognition that my relationship with Riverside Baptist Church would never be the same. Pastor Williams had positioned himself as the spiritual authority in my life, and challenging that authority meant challenging the entire structure of relationships that had defined my church experience. Over the weekend, I received visits from several congregation members who had heard rumors about financial problems and wanted to understand what was happening. Most were shocked to learn about the extent of Pastor Williams's financial mismanagement and the pressure he had placed on me to provide ongoing funding. My friend Helen arrived Saturday morning with a coffee cake and a troubled expression. "Estelle, I had no idea what you were going through. If we had known Pastor Williams was pressuring you like that, some of us would have spoken up." Her support felt genuine and healing, but it also highlighted how isolated I had become during the months of intensive financial pressure. Pastor Williams had managed to separate me from normal church relationships by elevating my status as a major donor while simultaneously making me responsible for solving every ministry funding challenge. "I should have said something sooner," I admitted, But he made it seem like questioning his requests was questioning God's will. I felt guilty every time I hesitated to write another check. Helen's face hardened with anger. That's not biblical stewardship. That's manipulation. No pastor should make anyone feel guilty for exercising wisdom about their giving. Her validation meant more to me than any recognition ceremony or public appreciation. Pastor Williams had orchestrated. For the first time in months, I felt like someone understood that I was a person with legitimate needs and boundaries, not just a source of funding for ministry projects. Sunday morning presented the question of whether to attend church as usual. I decided to go, partly out of curiosity about how Pastor Williams would handle the crisis, and partly to demonstrate that I wouldn't be intimidated into hiding from the situation he had created. The sanctuary felt different as I took my usual seat near the middle section. Conversation stopped when people noticed me, and I could feel the weight of curious and concerned glances throughout the service. Pastor Williams appeared composed as he delivered his sermon, but his topic choice seemed deliberately pointed. He preached about Ananias and Sapphira, the New Testament couple who died after lying about their financial giving to the early church. His emphasis on the dangers of withholding resources from God's work felt like a direct attack on my refusal to fund his crisis management. Sometimes, Pastor Williams declared from the pulpit, God tests our faithfulness through financial trials. He wants to see if we'll trust him enough to give sacrificially, even when our human wisdom suggests caution. The sermon was clearly designed to make me feel guilty about refusing his latest requests, while positioning my decision as spiritual disobedience rather than reasonable financial stewardship. But instead of guilt, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Pastor Williams's public manipulation tactics were now transparent to me, robbed of their power to generate shame or compliance. After the service, several members approached me with expressions of support and concern. They had heard enough rumors to understand that something significant was happening, and many seemed troubled by Pastor Williams's sermon topic given the circumstances. That felt inappropriate, whispered Janet Murphy, the board member who had been present during Friday's confrontational meeting. Using the pulpit to pressure individual members about their giving crosses a line. Her comment confirmed that I wasn't overreacting to Pastor Williams's behavior. Other leaders in the church were also recognizing that his conduct had violated appropriate boundaries between pastoral authority and personal financial decisions. As I drove home from church, I realized that the crisis had revealed something important about my spiritual growth. For months, I had allowed Pastor Williams to define my relationship with God primarily through financial generosity, accepting his interpretation of biblical stewardship without question. But his exploitation of my grief and faith had ultimately forced me to develop my own understanding of what faithful giving actually meant. True stewardship wasn't about saying yes to every request that came wrapped in spiritual language. It wasn't about allowing religious leaders to make financial decisions on my behalf. It wasn't about sacrificing my security to fund other people's vision projects. Biblical generosity required wisdom, accountability, and respect for the giver's legitimate needs and boundaries. It demanded transparency about how funds would be used and honest communication about financial challenges. Most importantly, it respected the giver as a person rather than treating them as a resource to be exploited. Pastor Williams had violated every one of these principles in his campaign to access my inheritance. He had used manipulation instead of honesty, pressure instead of respect, and spiritual authority as a tool for personal financial gain. His behavior represented the opposite of biblical leadership, regardless of how he justified it through religious rhetoric. That evening, I called Patricia Hendricks to confirm our Tuesday meeting and inform her about the weekend's development. Her legal training allowed her to spot patterns of behavior that I was only beginning to understand. What you're describing sounds like a systematic campaign to exploit your vulnerability during grief, she said. The use of religious authority to pressure financial compliance is a recognized form of fraud, especially when it targets recently widowed individuals. Patricia's analysis helped me understand that my experience wasn't just about poor church leadership or misguided generosity. It was about predatory behavior disguised as spiritual guidance, designed to extract maximum financial benefit from my emotional vulnerability. The recognition was painful but ultimately liberating. I had been the victim of calculated exploitation, not the spiritual failure Pastor Williams wanted me to believe I was. My growing resistance to his demands represented healthy boundaries, not selfish rebellion against God's will. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt more peaceful than I had in months. The crisis Pastor Williams had created was far from resolved, and I knew the coming weeks would bring additional challenges and confrontation. But for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was making decisions based on my own wisdom and values, rather than responding to external pressure and manipulation. The breaking point had arrived, and I had survived it with my integrity, and whatever happened next, I would face it as myself, rather than as Pastor Williams's primary source of ministry funding. The Tuesday morning meeting with Patricia Hendricks changed everything. Her downtown law office felt like sanctuary compared to the emotional battlefield my home had become, with its steady stream of visitors trying to convince me to rescue the church from Pastor Williams's financial disaster. Patricia had prepared meticulously for our consultation, spreading documents across her conference table like evidence in a criminal case. "Estelle, what I'm seeing here goes far beyond poor financial management," she began, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed bank statements and donation records. "This appears to be a deliberate pattern of exploitation targeting your vulnerability as a recent widow." She pointed to dates on various documents, showing how Pastor Williams's requests had escalated immediately after Robert's funeral. "Notice how the frequency and amounts increased as soon as your inheritance was settled. He wasn't waiting for you to process your grief or make thoughtful decisions about your future. He was positioning himself to capture as much of your assets as possible while you were emotionally vulnerable." The timeline was damning when laid out chronologically. Pastor Williams had given me barely 2 weeks after Robert's burial before beginning his campaign for major donations. Every subsequent request had built on previous compliance, using my demonstrated generosity as justification for increasingly presumptuous demand. Patricia opened a thick legal folder containing research on religious fraud cases. "What you've experienced fits a recognized pattern that law enforcement calls spiritual abuse for financial gain. Perpetrators use religious authority to override normal skepticism and create artificial urgency around financial decisions." She showed me case studies of other situations where religious leaders had exploited congregants' faith and trust for personal financial benefit. The similarities to my experience were chilling. In each case, the victim had been isolated from normal advisory relationships, pressured to make quick decisions about large sums, and manipulated through spiritual language that made resistance seem like rebellion against God. "The good news is that much of what you've donated may be recoverable," Patricia continued. "When religious leaders use deception or undue influence to secure donations, those gifts can be legally challenged as products of fraud." Recovery seemed impossible given how public my donations had been, but Patricia explained how documentation could prove that my giving had been coerced rather than freely chosen. Pastor Williams's own behavior provided evidence of manipulation, from his unauthorized use of ministry funds to his pressure campaigns involving family members and board representatives. "I want to be clear about something," Patricia said, her tone becoming more serious. "Pursuing this legally will be difficult emotionally. Pastor Williams and his supporters will likely attack your character and motivations. They'll claim you're being vindictive or trying to destroy the church out of personal spite." Her warning proved prophetic. Within hours of my meeting with Patricia, word had apparently spread through certain church circles that I was consulting with an attorney. My phone began ringing with calls from congregation members, some expressing support but others voicing concern about my adversarial approach to resolving the crisis. Margaret Williams called that evening, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine distress. "Estelle, dear, surely we can work this out within the church family. Getting lawyers involved will only hurt everyone, especially the innocent members who depend on our ministry." Her appeal to my concern for other congregation members was carefully calculated. Margaret knew I cared deeply about the people of Riverside Baptist and wouldn't want my actions to harm their spiritual home. But her approach also revealed how completely the Williams family viewed my inheritance as their solution to whatever problems they had created. "Margaret, I didn't create this financial crisis. I replied gently but firmly. Your husband made decisions that put the church at risk, and now he expects me to solve problems I had no part in causing. The conversation ended with Margaret in tears and me feeling guilty despite knowing I had done nothing wrong. Pastor Williams had trained his entire family to use emotional manipulation as a tool for extracting compliance, and they deployed those skills whenever their financial interests were threatened. The next Sunday brought a church-wide meeting that Pastor Williams had called to address rumors and misunderstandings about the church's financial situation. I attended despite Patricia's advice to avoid potentially confrontational situations, feeling that my absence would be interpreted as guilt or cowardice by those who still supported the pastor. The fellowship hall was packed with members who rarely attended anything beyond Sunday morning worship. Drawn by curiosity about the crisis everyone was discussing in whispered conversation, Pastor Williams had clearly prepared extensively for this presentation, with charts and graphs designed to minimize the appearance of financial mismanagement, while maximizing the urgency of immediate fundraising needs. Like many growing ministries, we've encountered some cash flow challenges as we've expanded our outreach and facilities, he began, his tone measured and pastoral despite the gravity of the situation. These are temporary difficulties that can be resolved through the generous support of our church family. His sanitized description of the crisis bore little resemblance to the desperate panic he had displayed in my living room the week before. Pastor Williams was presenting the mortgage delinquency and contractor disputes as normal growing pains, rather than consequences of his unauthorized financial decisions. But several board members had apparently decided to provide more complete information than Pastor Williams preferred. Tom Henderson stood during the question period and addressed the congregation with the directness that had made him successful in banking. I want everyone to understand that these aren't just cash flow problems, Tom said, his voice cutting through the polite atmosphere Pastor Williams had tried to maintain. We have serious accountability issues that need to be addressed before we can responsibly ask anyone for additional donations. Tom's statement created a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs throughout the hall. Most congregation members had trusted Pastor Williams's leadership implicitly for years, and weren't prepared to hear board members questioning his financial management. Pastor Williams tried to regain control by dismissing Tom's concerns as technical banking issues that didn't affect the essential mission of the church. But Tom persisted, outlining specific irregularities he had discovered during his review of church financial records. Money was moved between accounts without proper authorization, Tom continued, ignoring Pastor Williams's obvious discomfort. Ministry funds were used for operational expenses without board approval, and commitments were made for major expenditures based on assumptions about future donations that hadn't been confirmed. The last point hit me directly since everyone knew Tom was referring to Pastor Williams's expectation that I would fund whatever projects he deemed worthy of support. Several congregation members turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to barely concealed anger. Sarah Mitchell took the floor next, her teacher's instincts making her focus on the educational aspects of the crisis. We need to understand how these problems developed so we can prevent them from happening again. That means implementing proper oversight procedures and financial accountability measures. But Pastor Williams clearly had no intention of submitting to increased oversight or accountability. His response revealed the authoritarian mindset that had enabled his financial mismanagement in the first place. I appreciate everyone's concern, he said, his tone becoming subtly condescending. But pastoral leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions that business-minded people might not understand. Ministry isn't run like a corporation, and we can't let financial fears override spiritual vision. His dismissal of legitimate accountability concerns as business thinking versus spiritual vision was classic manipulation, designed to make oversight seem like lack of faith rather than responsible stewardship. But the board members weren't accepting his deflection as easily as they had in the past. Janet Murphy stood to address the congregation with obvious reluctance, but her sense of responsibility overcame her discomfort with confrontation. I've served on this board for 8 years, and I can honestly say we've never had proper oversight of major financial decisions. That needs to change regardless of who our pastor is. Her statement represented a direct challenge to Pastor Williams's leadership style and decision-making authority. The congregation was witnessing something unprecedented. Elected church leaders publicly questioning their pastor's management practices and demanding changes in how the church operated. Pastor Williams's response was swift and defensive. "I'm disappointed that some board members seem more interested in creating division than supporting ministry. This kind of internal conflict is exactly what Satan uses to destroy effective church." His accusation that accountability demands represented satanic attack was breathtakingly manipulative, designed to make his critics seem like enemies of God's work rather than responsible church leaders. But the tactic that had worked so effectively on me was beginning to lose its power with people who had witnessed the consequences of his unrestrained authority. The meeting ended without resolution, with Pastor Williams promising to provide additional financial documentation while insisting that immediate fundraising was necessary to prevent catastrophic consequences. But the damage to his credibility was obvious, and several congregation members approached board members afterward with questions and concerns. I left the meeting feeling simultaneously vindicated and sad. My refusal to fund Pastor Williams's crisis management was no longer an isolated act of rebellion against spiritual authority. Other church leaders were recognizing the same problems I had identified, and they were demanding changes that Pastor Williams clearly had no intention of implementing. Over the following week, the congregation began fracturing along predictable lines. Longtime members who had benefited from Pastor Williams's leadership were reluctant to believe he had seriously mismanaged church finance. Younger members and recent additions were more willing to question his authority and demand accountability measures. The Williams family responded to this challenge by intensifying their campaign to portray me as the villain in the situation. Rebecca Williams posted carefully worded messages on social media about how certain individuals were using personal grievances to attack faithful ministry. David Williams preached at his developing church plant about the persecution that true servants faced from worldly-minded critics. Margaret Williams took a more direct approach, visiting congregation members individually to share her version of events. According to several people who reported her comments to me, Margaret was claiming that I had turned against the church after Pastor Williams gently questioned my excessive giving that was creating unhealthy dependence. The irony was staggering. Pastor Williams, who had spent months pressuring me for increasingly large donations, was now claiming he had tried to discourage my generosity. Margaret was rewriting history to portray my financial exploitation as pastoral concern for my emotional well-being. But their character assassination campaign began backfiring when congregation members started comparing Margaret's claims with their own observations of Pastor Williams's behavior. Several people remembered his public celebrations of my giving and his obvious expectation that I would fund whatever projects he announced. Helen called me Thursday evening with an update on the internal church politics that were developed. People are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about how much the Williams family has benefited from your donations. Rebecca's tuition, David's church startup funding, all those family trips they've taken to ministry conferences that looked more like vacation. Her observations highlighted an aspect of the situation I had been too polite to examine closely. Pastor Williams hadn't just mismanaged church funds, he had directed substantial portions of my donations toward his family's personal benefit. The pattern suggested that my inheritance had been viewed as a resource for improving the Williams family's lifestyle rather than genuinely advancing ministry goals. Patricia Hendricks had been investigating this angle as well, subpoenaing financial records that revealed troubling connections between my donations and expenditures that seemed designed to benefit Pastor Williams personally. Church credit cards had been used for family dining and travel expenses that were difficult to justify as ministry-related. David's church plant had received funding far exceeding what comparable startups typically required, with much of the excess going toward equipment and facilities that seemed unusually luxurious for a new congregation. We're building a strong case for recovery of misappropriated funds, Patricia told me during our Friday afternoon consultation, but I want to prepare you for the escalation that's likely to occur once we file formal legal action. Her warning proved accurate. The following Monday I received a registered letter from Pastor Williams's attorney, threatening defamation action if I continued spreading false accusations about his client's faithful ministry service. The letter demanded that I cease all communications with congregation members regarding internal church matters, and publicly retract any statements questioning Pastor Williams's integrity or competence. The legal threat was clearly designed to intimidate me into silence while Pastor Williams continued his damage control campaign, but Patricia had anticipated this response and was prepared with a counter-strategy that would expose his behavior to broader scrutiny. Let them file a defamation suit, she advised with grim satisfaction. Discovery proceedings will require them to produce financial records that will document everything they've been trying to hide. Meanwhile, the church board was conducting its own investigation of financial irregularities, with Tom Henderson taking the lead in reviewing bank statements and expenditure records. What they discovered was worse than what Pastor Williams had revealed during his panicked visit to my house. The mortgage delinquency was just the beginning. Pastor Williams had also fallen behind on payments to contractors, utility companies, and even the church's insurance provider. He had borrowed against the church's investment accounts without authorization, and used ministry funds to cover personal expenses that he classified as pastoral support or ministry development. Most damaging was evidence that Pastor Williams had been soliciting donations from multiple sources for the same projects, essentially double billing for initiatives like David's church plant and the fellowship hall expansion. My contributions to these projects had been supplemented by grants and other donations that Pastor Williams had apparently diverted to different purposes. Tom Henderson presented this information to an emergency board meeting on Thursday evening, recommending immediate action to protect the church's remaining assets and establish proper financial oversight. The board voted unanimously to require Pastor Williams to relinquish all financial authority and submit to external auditing of all church accounts. Pastor Williams's response was predictably explosive. He accused the board of staging a coup, motivated by jealousy of his successful ministry. He claimed that outside influences had poisoned certain members against his leadership, and warned that their actions would destroy everything God has built through this church. But his threats and accusations fell flat with board members, who had seen the financial document. Pastor Williams's credibility was gone, replaced by recognition that his leadership had put the church's very existence at risk through irresponsible and possibly illegal financial practices. The confrontation reached its climax during Sunday morning worship, when Pastor Williams used his sermon to launch a direct attack on his critics within the congregation. His message, ostensibly about false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing, was clearly directed at board members and anyone else who had questioned his authority. Some people claim to love this church while working to destroy it from within, he declared from the pulpit, his voice rising with righteous indignation. They use worldly wisdom to attack spiritual leadership, preferring their own understanding to God's anointed authority. The sermon was so obviously personal and vindictive that several congregation members walked out during its delivery. Others sat in stunned silence as their pastor used the sacred space of worship to attack people they respected and trusted. After the service, Tom Henderson approached the pulpit and asked to address the congregation. Pastor Williams initially refused, but the murmur of support from the sanctuary convinced him that blocking Tom's statement would only worsen his position. I want everyone to know that the board has discovered serious financial irregularities that require immediate attention, Tom announced, his banker's composure intact despite the charged atmosphere. We're implementing emergency measures to protect church assets and ensure proper accountability going forward. Pastor Williams tried to interrupt with accusations about unauthorized board actions and violation of pastoral authority, but Tom continued with calm determination. Any congregation member who wants to review our findings can request copies of the financial documentation we've compiled. Transparency is essential for rebuilding trust and moving forward responsibly. The offer of public access to financial records represented a complete rejection of Pastor Williams's secretive management style. Board members were choosing congregational accountability over pastoral authority, prioritizing the church's welfare over their leader's reputation. That afternoon, Pastor Williams called an emergency meeting with his remaining supporters, attempting to rally opposition to the board's actions. But his base of support was eroding as more congregation members learned about the financial problems his decisions had created. Margaret Williams made one final attempt to recruit me as an ally, appearing at my door Sunday evening with tears and desperate appeals for reconciliation. "Estelle, you have to help us stop this destruction of our church family. These people are using financial technicalities to tear apart everything we've built together." Her plea revealed how completely the Williams family had come to view my inheritance as their personal resource for solving whatever problems arose. Even facing the collapse of Pastor Williams's ministry, Margaret assumed I should prioritize their interests over truthful accountability for financial mismanagement. "Margaret, your husband created these problems through his own choices," I replied with sadness rather than anger. "I can't fix what he broke, and I won't enable him to continue making the same mistakes." Her departure marked the end of any pretense that our relationship could survive Pastor Williams's exploitation of my grief and generosity. The Williams family had made their choice to view me as a resource rather than a person, and now they were experiencing the consequences of that decision. Tuesday brought news that Pastor Williams had submitted his resignation to the board, citing irreconcilable differences with certain members who have lost sight of our ministry mission. His resignation letter blamed everyone except himself for the crisis, portraying his departure as martyrdom rather than accountability for financial mismanagement. The board accepted his resignation immediately and began the process of securing church assets and implementing proper financial oversight. Tom Henderson was appointed as interim treasurer with authority to review all expenditures and ensure compliance with proper procedure. Pastor Williams's final Sunday at Riverside Baptist was scheduled for the following week, giving him opportunity to say farewell to the congregation he had served faithfully for 20 years. But his farewell sermon was another exercise in self-justification and blame-shifting rather than taking responsibility for the problems he had created. "I leave you with a heavy heart," he announced from the pulpit one last time, "knowing that some have chosen financial concerns over spiritual vision. I pray that God will forgive those who have prioritized worldly wisdom over faithful ministry." His inability to acknowledge any responsibility for the church's financial crisis was stunning even to those who had supported him longest. Pastor Williams was departing as he had led, refusing accountability and blaming others for consequences of his own poor decision. After the service, several congregation members approached me with apologies for not recognizing earlier what Pastor Williams had been doing. They had witnessed his pressure campaigns, but assumed I was participating willingly rather than being manipulated through spiritual authority and emotional vulnerability. "We should have spoken up when we saw how he was treating you," Helen said with obvious regret. "No one should have to deal with that kind of pressure, especially while they're grieving." Her apology meant more to me than any recognition ceremony Pastor Williams had orchestrated. For the first time in months, I felt seen as a person rather than a source of funding for ministry projects. The weeks following Pastor Williams's departure brought a period of healing and reflection for the congregation. The board implemented new financial procedures requiring multiple approvals for major expenditures and regular reporting to the membership. They hired an interim pastor who focused on spiritual healing rather than aggressive fundraising campaigns. Patricia Hendricks continued pursuing legal recovery of misappropriated funds, but her efforts were complicated by Pastor Williams's attempts to hide assets and delay proceedings. He had apparently been preparing for possible legal challenges by transferring money to accounts controlled by family members and claiming that various expenditures had been properly authorized. But the civil litigation was less important to me than the personal healing that came from recognizing how completely I had been manipulated. Pastor Williams had exploited every aspect of my vulnerability, from my grief over Robert's death to my desire to honor his memory through generous giving. Understanding the manipulation was painful but ultimately liberating. I hadn't failed spiritually by questioning Pastor Williams's requests or setting boundaries around my giving. I had been victimized by someone who used religious authority to override my normal judgment and extract maximum financial benefit from my emotional vulnerability. The recovery process was slow and sometimes difficult, requiring me to rebuild confidence in my own discernment while learning to distinguish between legitimate ministry needs and exploitative manipulation. But for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was making decisions based on my own values and wisdom rather than external pressure disguised as spiritual guidance. Most importantly, I was beginning to understand that true Christian stewardship required protecting myself from exploitation just as much as it required generous giving to worthy causes. Pastor Williams had convinced me that questioning his authority was spiritual rebellion, but I now understood that holding religious leaders accountable was actually a form of faithful stewardship. The church would survive Pastor Williams's financial mismanagement, and I would recover from his exploitation of my grief and generosity. Both institutions and individuals could heal from spiritual abuse when truth replaced manipulation and accountability replaced unchecked authority. My inheritance was still substantial despite Pastor Williams's campaign to capture as much of it as possible for his ministry projects. But more importantly, I had regained my voice, my judgment, and my understanding of what faithful Christian living actually required. Robert would have been proud of my growing strength and wisdom. He had always encouraged me to think independently and trust my own instincts, qualities that Pastor Williams had systematically undermined through spiritual manipulation and emotional pressure. Now I was reclaiming those qualities and using them to build a life based on my own understanding of faith, generosity, and stewardship, rather than someone else's exploitation of my vulnerability. 6 months after Pastor Williams's departure, I received an unexpected phone call that would complete my understanding of just how extensively I had been targeted for financial exploitation. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Maria Rodriguez from the County Financial Crimes Unit, and her reason for calling made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Warren, we're investigating a pattern of financial fraud involving religious organizations, and your name has come up in connection with several cases we're building against Pastor Williams and his associates." Detective Rodriguez explained that my situation was not unique. Pastor Williams had apparently used similar tactics on vulnerable congregation members in 2 previous churches before arriving at Riverside Baptist. In each case, he had identified recently widowed women with substantial assets and systematically extracted large donations through emotional manipulation and spiritual coercion. "We have documentation showing that he researched your financial situation extensively before your husband's death," Detective Rodriguez continued. "He obtained copies of property records, business valuations, and even insurance policies through sources we're still investigating." The revelation that Pastor Williams had been planning his campaign against my inheritance, while Robert was still alive, added a new dimension of violation to everything I had experienced. His pastoral care during my grief hadn't been motivated by Christian compassion but by calculated preparation for financial exploitation. Detective Rodriguez requested a meeting to review my documentation and provide testimony for the criminal investigation. Patricia Hendricks accompanied me to the police station, where we spent 3 hours detailing the progression of Pastor Williams's requests and the methods he had used to extract compliance. "What you're describing fits the classic pattern we see in clergy financial abuse cases," Detective Rodriguez explained as she reviewed Patricia's documentation. "Targeting vulnerable individuals, using religious authority to override normal skepticism, creating artificial urgency around financial decisions, and isolating victims from independent advisor." The detective showed me files on Pastor Williams's previous victims, women whose stories paralleled mine with disturbing accuracy. Each had been approached shortly after a major loss, pressured into substantial donations for ministry projects that were poorly managed or never completed, and then abandoned when their resources were exhausted or they began asking uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Lee Eleanor Hutchins lost nearly $400,000 to Pastor Williams when he was serving a church in Alabama, Detective Rodriguez said, showing me a thick case file. She was widowed at 62, and had no family to provide guidance about his requests for funding various ministry initiatives. Eleanor's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Pastor Williams had used the same tactics, the same biblical justifications, even the same specific projects to extract donations from her inheritance. The fellowship hall expansion, the youth ministry development fund, the family member needing educational support, all had been deployed against Eleanor exactly as they had been used against me. The difference in your case, Detective Rodriguez noted, is that you recognized the exploitation and sought help before losing everything. Most of his victims don't realize what's happening until their resources are completely gone. The criminal investigation revealed that Pastor Williams had refined his exploitation techniques over years of practice, learning what approaches worked most effectively on different types of victims. He had developed detailed profiles of ideal targets, focusing on recently widowed women in their 50s and 60s who had strong faith backgrounds and limited experience managing substantial financial assets. Patricia had been working with Detective Rodriguez's team to trace the flow of funds from my donations to the Williams family's personal accounts. The evidence showed a pattern of financial benefit that went far beyond any reasonable interpretation of pastoral support or ministry expenses. Your donations funded a lifestyle that Pastor Williams couldn't have afforded on his church salary, Patricia explained during one of our strategy meetings. Family vacations classified as ministry trips, luxury car purchases justified as transportation for church activities, private school tuition for his children described as Christian education support. The documentation was damning, showing how Pastor Williams had systematically diverted charitable donations to personal use, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate ministry expenses. His elaborate justifications for each expenditure revealed the calculating mindset behind his spiritual manipulation. But the criminal case was complicated by Pastor Williams's attempts to destroy evidence and intimidate potential witnesses. He had apparently learned of the investigation through sources in law enforcement and was actively working to undermine the prosecution's case. He's been contacting his former victims and pressuring them not to cooperate with our investigation, Detective Rodriguez warned during one of our meetings. He's claiming that testifying against him would be attacking God's work and could result in spiritual consequences for anyone who participates. Pastor Williams's continued use of spiritual manipulation to protect himself from criminal consequences was particularly disturbing. Even facing potential prosecution for fraud, he was still exploiting people's faith to serve his personal interests. The pressure campaign extended to character assassination attempts designed to discredit my testimony. Pastor Williams and his supporters began spreading rumors about my mental stability, claiming that grief had affected my judgment, and that my accusations were products of emotional instability rather than factual evidence. Margaret Williams led this effort, visiting former church members and community leaders with carefully crafted stories about my descent into bitterness following Robert's death. According to her version of events, Pastor Williams had tried to help me through my grief, but I had turned against him when he gently suggested that my excessive giving might be emotionally motivated rather than spiritually guided. The irony of Margaret claiming that Pastor Williams had tried to discourage my giving was almost amusing, except for the damage it was doing to my reputation in the community. People who didn't know the details of what had occurred were hearing only her side of the story, and some were beginning to view me with suspicion rather than sympathy. Helen and several other church members rallied to my defense, organizing their own information campaign to counter the Williams family's character assassination effort. They shared documentation of Pastor Williams's financial mismanagement and reminded people of the board's findings about unauthorized expenditures and questionable accounting practices. Anyone who thinks Estelle is lying about what happened should review the financial records that Tom Henderson compiled, Helen told everyone who would listen. The evidence speaks for itself regardless of what the Williams family claimed. The support from my true friends was invaluable during this difficult period, but the stress of being publicly attacked while cooperating with a criminal investigation was taking its toll. Patricia recommended that I consider relocating temporarily to avoid continued harassment, but I refused to be driven from my home by people who had already taken so much from me. Instead, I decided to take a different approach to managing the situation. Rather than hiding from the controversy, I began speaking publicly about financial exploitation in religious settings, sharing my story as a warning to others who might be vulnerable to similar manipulation. My first speaking engagement was at a women's group meeting in a neighboring town, where I described the progression of Pastor Williams's exploitation and the red flags that I had initially ignored. The response was overwhelming, with several attendees sharing their own experiences of financial pressure from religious leaders. I gave $15,000 to our pastor for a missions emergency that I later learned was actually to pay his family's credit card debt, one woman confided after my presentation. But I felt too ashamed to tell anyone because he convinced me that questioning his authority was questioning God. These conversations revealed how widespread financial exploitation was in religious communities, and how effectively spiritual manipulation prevented victims from seeking help or reporting abuse. Pastor Williams's tactics were not unique. They were part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior that targeted people's faith and trust. My speaking engagements led to invitations to participate in educational programs for law enforcement and social services about recognizing and investigating religious financial fraud. Detective Rodriguez asked me to help train other investigators about the psychological aspects of spiritual manipulation and the unique challenges involved in prosecuting clergy abuse cases. Victims of religious financial fraud often resist cooperating with investigations because they've been conditioned to view their exploitation as spiritual testing, I explained during one training session. Perpetrators use biblical language and religious concepts to make resistance seem like rebellion against God. The educational work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, transforming my experience of victimization into a resource for protecting others from similar exploitation. Each presentation helped me process what had happened while potentially preventing other people from enduring the same manipulation. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Pastor Williams was moving forward despite his attempts at obstruction. Grand jury proceedings resulted in indictments for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in significant prison time if he was convicted. Pastor Williams's response to the indictments was characteristically self-serving, claiming that he was being persecuted for his faith by secular authorities who didn't understand the spiritual nature of ministry finance. He launched a public relations campaign portraying himself as a martyr for religious freedom rather than acknowledging the criminal behavior he was accused of committing. But his victim narrative was undermined by the mounting evidence of systematic financial exploitation across multiple churches and victims. The prosecution had compiled documentation showing a clear pattern of predatory behavior that had nothing to do with legitimate ministry activity. The civil litigation that Patricia was pursuing parallel to the criminal case was also yielding positive results. We had successfully frozen several of Pastor Williams's assets, and were recovering substantial portions of the money he had diverted from charitable donations to personal use. We've identified nearly $200,000 in recoverable assets so far, Patricia reported during one of our quarterly reviews. The process is slow because he's hidden money in various accounts and investments, but we're methodically tracing every transaction. The financial recovery was important not just for its monetary value but for the vindication it provided. Each dollar recovered represented proof that Pastor Williams had illegally diverted charitable donations to personal benefit, validating my accusations and discrediting his claims of innocent ministry leadership. But the most significant healing came from reconnecting with the authentic faith community that I had lost during Pastor Williams's exploitation. The interim pastor at Riverside Baptist, Dr. James Mitchell, was helping the congregation recover from the spiritual trauma of discovering that their leader had been systematically manipulating and exploiting vulnerable members. Spiritual abuse leaves scars that are just as real as physical violence, Dr. Mitchell explained during one of his sermons on healing from leadership betrayal. Recovery requires acknowledging what happened, holding perpetrators accountable, and rebuilding trust through transparent, accountable leadership. Under Mitchell's guidance, the church implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future exploitation of congregation members. New financial oversight procedures required multiple approvals for any expenditure over a specific threshold, regular reporting to the membership, and external auditing of all church accounts. More importantly, the church established clear boundaries around pastoral authority and congregation member autonomy. Mitchell made it clear that spiritual leadership never included the right to pressure people about personal financial decisions, or to use emotional manipulation to extract compliance with request for donation. Biblical stewardship is about each individual's relationship with God regarding their resources, Dr. Mitchell preached during one particularly healing service. No pastor, no matter how well-intentioned, has the authority to make financial decisions for congregation members, or to pressure them into giving beyond their comfort level. These sermons were balm to my soul, validating what I had instinctively known but had been conditioned to doubt during Pastor Williams's campaign of exploitation. True spiritual leadership respected individual autonomy rather than overriding it through manipulation and pressure. I began attending church regularly again, finding peace in worship that wasn't contaminated by hidden agendas or ulterior motives. Dr. Mitchell's leadership style was collaborative rather than authoritarian, seeking input from congregation members, rather than expecting unquestioning compliance with his vision. The congregation was also healing, with many members expressing regret about their failure to recognize Pastor Williams's exploitation, or to speak up when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. These conversations led to the development of new protocols for reporting concerns about leadership conduct and protecting vulnerable members from potential abuse. "We failed you, Estelle," Tom Henderson said during one particularly emotional church meeting. "We saw what was happening but told ourselves it wasn't our place to interfere. We should have spoken up and protected you from that kind of pressure." The apologies were meaningful, but more important was the commitment to institutional changes that would prevent similar exploitation in the future. Riverside Baptist was becoming a genuinely safe spiritual community rather than a platform for one person's unchecked authority and personal agenda. A year after Pastor Williams's departure, the criminal trial began with jury selection and opening statements. I testified during the prosecution's case, describing the progression of manipulation and exploitation that had characterized my experience with the defendant. Pastor Williams used my grief and my faith as tools to extract money from my inheritance, I told the jury during my direct examination. He presented his requests as divine guidance, while creating emotional pressure that made refusals seem like spiritual failure. The defense attorney tried to portray my testimony as the confused recollections of a grieving widow who had misunderstood Pastor Williams's well-intentioned pastoral care. But the documentation Patricia had compiled made it impossible to deny the systematic nature of his exploitation. Cross-examination was challenging, with Pastor Williams's attorney suggesting that I had given willingly and was now experiencing donor's remorse, that I was unfairly blaming on his client. But my testimony remained consistent with the evidence, and the prosecutor was able to demonstrate clear patterns of manipulation that went far beyond normal pastoral interaction. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from multiple victims, financial experts, and law enforcement investigators. Pastor Williams maintained his innocence throughout, claiming that he had been faithfully serving God's kingdom, and that his accusers were motivated by personal vendettas rather than legitimate grievance. But the jury saw through his self-serving testimony, finding him guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, and ordered restitution to his victims totaling over $1.2 million. The conviction provided a sense of justice and closure that I had never expected to receive. Pastor Williams's exploitation had been officially recognized as criminal behavior, validating my experience, and potentially deterring similar abuse by other religious leaders. More importantly, the case had raised awareness about financial exploitation in religious settings and had led to policy changes designed to protect vulnerable congregation members. Several denominations implemented new oversight procedures inspired by the reforms at Riverside Baptist, creating institutional safeguards against pastoral abuse of financial authority. My inheritance was largely intact despite Pastor Williams's exploitation, thanks to Patricia's successful recovery efforts, and my eventual recognition of the manipulation I was experiencing. But more valuable than the financial recovery was the personal growth that had resulted from surviving and exposing his predatory behavior. I had learned to trust my own judgment rather than deferring automatically to religious authority. I had developed the ability to distinguish between legitimate spiritual guidance and manipulative exploitation. Most importantly, I had discovered that protecting myself from abuse was not selfishness, but responsible stewardship of the resources and relationships God had entrusted to my care. Robert would have been proud of my strength and resilience during this ordeal. His memory had been honored not through the excessive donations Pastor Williams had extracted, but through my determination to seek justice and protect others from similar exploitation. Today, I continue speaking about financial exploitation in religious settings, helping law enforcement agencies and social service organizations understand the unique challenges involved in these cases. My experience has become a resource for protecting others, rather than simply a personal trauma to overcome. The inheritance that Pastor Williams tried so hard to capture for his personal benefit is now being used for genuinely charitable purposes. I support organizations that help abuse survivors, fund educational programs about financial exploitation, and contribute to legitimate ministries that operate with transparency and accountability. Most importantly, I have learned that true Christian stewardship requires wisdom, discernment, and self-protection, rather than blind compliance with requests that come wrapped in spiritual language. Faith and prudence are not contradictory, they are complementary aspects of responsible living that honor both God and the resources He provides. Pastor Williams thought he could exploit my grief and faith to capture my inheritance for his personal agenda. Instead, his predatory behavior ultimately strengthened my faith, clarified my values, and equipped me to help others avoid similar exploitation. In the end, his manipulation backfired completely, producing exactly the opposite of what he had intended to accomplish. The greatest victory was not the financial recovery, or even the criminal conviction, but the personal transformation that enabled me to reclaim my voice, my judgment, and my understanding of what faithful Christian living actually requires. I am no longer the vulnerable widow who could be manipulated through spiritual pressure and emotional exploitation. I am a strong, wise woman who knows how to protect herself while genuinely serving others through thoughtful, accountable generosity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.